On February 26, 2022, 2 days after Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and European Union made a decision that would change the global financial system forever. They announced that Russia would be cut off from SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. This is the messaging system that connects 11,000 banks in 200 countries. It processes $5 trillion in transactions every single day. Cutting Russia off meant Russian banks couldn't send or receive international payments. No trade finance, no cross-border transactions, economic isolation. The West celebrated. This is the nuclear option of financial sanctions. Russia would be crippled. The ruble would collapse. Putin would be forced to withdraw or face revolution at home. But 2.5 years later, something unexpected happened. Russia didn't collapse. The ruble recovered. Russian trade continued, just not through SWIFT. And worse for the West, dozens of other countries saw what happened and began building their own escape routes. Because if the US could cut Russia off for political reasons, it could cut off anyone. This pattern isn't new. It's happened 4 times in the last 110 years. Every single time the dominant power controls the financial system, weaponizes it, and then watches as that weapon destroys the foundation of its own dominance. Let me show you the 4 historical examples. The 5-stage pattern that repeats like clockwork, and why the US has about 20 years before the dollar loses reserve currency status entirely. Because when Britain weaponized finance in 1914, it lost reserve status by 1944, 30 years. The US weaponized SWIFT in 2022. The clock is ticking, and this time the decline will be faster because alternatives already exist and technology accelerates everything. Before I show you how the SWIFT weapon backfired, you need to understand what SWIFT actually is. SWIFT isn't a bank. It doesn't hold money. It doesn't transfer money. SWIFT is a messaging system. When a bank in New York wants to send money to Tokyo, SWIFT transmits the secure message between them. The actual money moves through correspondent banking relationships, but SWIFT is the communication network that makes it possible. SWIFT was created in 1973 by 239 banks in 15 countries. By 2024, it processes over 11 billion messages per year, about 45 million per day. SWIFT became the nervous system of global finance. And here's what makes SWIFT powerful. It's based in Belgium, technically neutral, but its board is dominated by American and European banks. The US has legal leverage because most international transactions settle in dollars through New York banks. This means the US can pressure SWIFT to exclude countries or banks. If you're cut off from SWIFT, you can't easily conduct international trade. You're economically isolated. The US has used this weapon before. In 2012, the US pressured SWIFT to disconnect Iranian banks. This was devastating for Iran. Oil exports collapsed because buyers couldn't pay. Iran's economy contracted 9%. Inflation hit 45%. The SWIFT weapon worked, or so it seemed. But Iran spent those years building alternative payment channels, barter arrangements, cryptocurrency, non-dollar trade with China, Russia, Turkey. But the 2022 Russia cutoff was different. This wasn't a small country like Iran. This was the world's 11th largest economy, a major energy exporter, a nuclear power. Cutting Russia off wasn't just economic warfare. It was a declaration that the US-controlled financial system could exclude anyone for political reasons. And every country watching understood the message. If you cross the US, you lose access to the global financial system. Your reserves can be frozen, your banks can be isolated, your economy can be strangled. This created an existential question for every non-Western country. Do you accept permanent vulnerability to US financial power, or do you build alternatives? Most chose to build alternatives, and that's when the SWIFT weapon backfired. Now let me show you the 4 historical precedents. Financial weaponization always backfires. The pattern has repeated 4 times in the last century. Example 1. Britain in World War I, 1914 to 1918. Before World War I, the British pound was the world's reserve currency. Britain controlled about 65% of international reserves. When war began in August 1914, Britain passed the Trading with the Enemy Act, allowing Britain to freeze assets of German nationals and companies. Britain seized German-owned businesses, bank accounts, ships, and property throughout the British Empire. This was unprecedented. International finance had always been separate from war. Britain broke this norm. The immediate effect was devastating for Germany. But neutral countries watched and learned a dangerous lesson. If Britain could seize German assets, it could seize anyone's assets during any conflict Britain deemed important. Your money in London wasn't safe unless Britain approved of your government. After World War I, neutral countries began diversifying reserves away from London. They increased gold holdings. They established accounts in New York, Paris, and other financial centers. The US benefited enormously. By 1920, the US held more gold reserves than Britain. By 1944, at Bretton Woods, the dollar formally replaced the pound as the world's reserve currency. Britain's financial weaponization in 1914 started a 30-year decline from dominance to irrelevance. Example 2. United States and Iran, 1979. When Iranian revolutionaries took American hostages in November 1979, President Carter froze all Iranian assets in U.S. banks, about $12 billion. This was the largest asset freeze in history at the time. Countries around the world suddenly realized that dollar reserves held in U.S. banks could be seized through executive order. The president could freeze your assets with a phone call. In the 1980s, OPEC countries diversified reserves. They reduced dollar holdings from about 85% in 1977 to about 71% by 1991. The dollar's share of global reserves began a slow decline that continues today. The Iranian freeze worked tactically, but strategically. It taught the world that dollar reserves could be weaponized. Example 3. United States and Russia, 2014. When Russia annexed Crimea in March 2014, the U.S. imposed targeted sanctions. But Russia wasn't cut off from SWIFT. The sanctions were calibrated, signaling disapproval but not forcing Russia into full alternative systems. This was a mistake because it gave Russia 8 years to prepare. From 2014 to 2022, Russia systematically reduced dollar dependency. Russia cut U.S. Treasury holdings from $130 billion to $2 billion. Russia increased gold reserves from 1,000 tons to 2,300 tons. Russia developed SPFS, its own version of SWIFT. Russia negotiated trade deals with China, India, and others that allowed payment in rubles, yuan, or rupees instead of dollars. Putin openly said in speeches that Russia was reducing dollar exposure because dollar reserves were unsafe. Western analysts dismissed this as bluster, but Russia was serious, and when the 2022 sanctions hit, Russia was ready. Example 4. United States and Russia, 2022. This is the big one. On February 26, 2022, the US and EU announced that major Russian banks would be cut off from SWIFT. Additionally, $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves held in Western financial institutions were frozen. This was the nuclear option. The immediate effect was dramatic. The ruble crashed 30% in 2 days. Russian stock market closed to prevent collapse. Western media declared economic victory. Russia would collapse within months. But then something unexpected happened. Russia stabilized. The Russian central bank hiked interest rates to 20%, stopping the ruble's fall. Russia demanded that European countries pay for gas in rubles, creating artificial demand. The ruble recovered all its losses within 3 months. Russian trade continued, just not through Western channels. Russia redirected oil exports to China, India, and Middle East. By 2023, Russian GDP grew 3.6%, faster than Germany or the UK. But the real damage wasn't to Russia. The real damage was to the dollar and SWIFT, because every country watching understood that the US would freeze reserves and cut off SWIFT for political reasons. If you're China, India, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, you're thinking, we're not at war with the US today. But what if we have a dispute tomorrow? Taiwan, Kashmir, Yemen, trade policy, anything. Could the US freeze our $1 trillion in reserves? The answer is obviously yes. The precedent is set. So what did these countries do? Exactly what Britain's enemies did in 1914 and Iran's allies did in 1979. They diversified away from the dollar and SWIFT. They built alternatives. And that's when the 5-stage backfire pattern began. Now let me show you the 5-stage framework. This is how financial weapons backfire. It's happened 4 times. It's happening right now. Stage 1, dominant power controls payment system. From 1973 to 2022, the US effectively controlled SWIFT. Not directly, but because most SWIFT transactions settle in dollars through New York correspondent banks, the US has leverage. This is the foundation of financial dominance. Stage 2, weaponize it for foreign policy. From 2001 to 2022, the US increasingly used financial sanctions. After 9/11, the US targeted terrorist financing. This expanded to rogue states, Iran, North Korea, then Russia in 2014. Each escalation normalized financial warfare. By 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, using the SWIFT weapon seemed obvious. Stage 3, targets find alternatives. Russia couldn't use SWIFT, so Russia used alternatives. SPFS, Russia's domestic system, expanded. CIPS, China's cross-border interbank payment system, became the main channel for Russia trade. By 2024, 40% of Russian trade was conducted in non-dollar currencies. Russia-China trade hit $240 billion in 2023, almost entirely in yuan and rubles. Russia proved you can be cut off from SWIFT and the dollar system and survive. Stage 4, neutral countries hedge. This is the critical stage. It's not just Russia finding alternatives. It's dozens of countries that aren't sanctioned but fear they might be someday. China saw what happened and accelerated de-dollarization. China reduced U.S. Treasury holdings from $1.3 trillion in 2013 to $775 billion by 2024. China increased gold reserves massively. China expanded CIAPs from processing $300 billion in 2021 to over $500 billion by 2024. Saudi Arabia, a U.S. ally for 80 years, saw the reserves freeze and reconsidered its position. In March 2023, Saudi Arabia announced it would accept yuan for oil sales to China. This broke the 50-year petrodollar monopoly. In December 2024, Saudi Arabia joined BRICS, signaling a shift away from exclusive U.S. alignment. The BRICS nations, now expanded to 9 members including Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia, are developing a shared payment system and discussing a common currency backed by gold and commodities. Over 50 central banks are now testing or implementing alternatives to dollar SWIFT dependence. This isn't because they're anti-American. It's because they saw $300 billion frozen with an executive order and realized their reserves are not safe. Stage 5, original weapon loses power. This is where we are now. SWIFT is still dominant but declining. Dollar's share of global reserves has fallen from 71% in 1999 to 58% in 2024. More importantly, the dollar's share of international trade settlement is declining from about 70% in 2022 to roughly 58% by 2024. That's a 15 percentage point drop in just 2 years. This is the fastest de-dollarization in history. SIPs processed 136 million messages in 2023, up from 91 million in 2022. That's 50% growth in 1 year. Alternative systems are scaling rapidly, and here's the key insight. The SWIFT weapon worked tactically in the short term. Russian economy faced shock, but strategically it failed. Russia survived. And the SWIFT weapon can never be used again with the same effectiveness because now targets expect it and prepare for it. And neutral countries have built alternatives, so they're not vulnerable. Now, let me show you the specific data proving this is happening right now. These aren't predictions. These are facts. Russian trade data. In 2021, before sanctions, 87% of Russian trade was settled in dollars or euros. By 2024, only 60%. That means 40% is now in yuan, rubles, rupees, dirhams, and other currencies. Russia is the test case proving you can operate outside the dollar SWIFT system. China's CIPS system. In 2020, CIPS processed about $12 trillion in payments for the full year. In 2023, about $27 trillion, more than doubled in 3 years. CIPS now connects over 1,400 financial institutions in 110 countries. This is a direct alternative to dollar SWIFT, and it's growing faster than SWIFT. Central bank gold purchases. In 2022, central banks bought 136 tons of gold. In 2023, 137 tons. In 2024, over 1,000 tons. This is 3 consecutive years of 1,000 plus ton purchases, the highest sustained buying since the 1970s, right before the collapse of Bretton Woods. Who's buying? China, Russia, Turkey, India, Poland, Singapore. These countries are converting dollar reserves into gold because gold can't be frozen or sanctioned. Petrodollar breakdown. For 50 years, oil was priced and sold exclusively in dollars. This created structural dollar demand. But in 2023-2024, that monopoly ended. Saudi Arabia accepts yuan from China. Russia sells oil to India in rupees. UAE accepts dirhams and yuan. The petrodollar isn't dead, but it's no longer a monopoly. And once the monopoly breaks, the advantage disappears quickly. The data is overwhelming. De-dollarization isn't a future threat. It's happening right now, and it's accelerating. Now let me show you the timeline. How long does the US have before the dollar loses reserve status? We can estimate by looking at Britain's decline. In 1914, Britain weaponized finance. In 1944, the dollar formally replaced the pound. That's 30 years from weaponization to replacement. But Britain also fought 2 world wars. The US isn't fighting world wars, so the decline might be slower, but modern technology accelerates everything. In 1914, building alternative payment systems took decades. In 2024, SIPs scaled from $12 trillion to $27 trillion in 3 years. My estimate, based on historical pattern and current acceleration, 15 to 25 years from 2022. That puts dollar reserve status collapse somewhere between 2037 and 2047. Not eliminated entirely, but no longer dominant. Dollar's share of reserves falls from 58% today to perhaps 35-40% by 2040. And here's what that means practically. Right now, the US can run unlimited budget deficits because the world needs dollars for trade and reserves. Foreign countries buy US treasuries to get dollars. This allows the US to borrow $2 trillion per year at low interest rates. But when dollar share of reserves falls below 40%, this advantage disappears. Foreign demand for treasuries collapses. US interest rates spike. Budget deficits become impossible. The American standard of living, which depends on importing more than we export and paying with printed dollars, becomes unsustainable. This is the end of the free lunch. Who wins? China wins massively. China is the obvious successor to U.S. financial dominance. CEPS is China's SWIFT. The yuan is becoming a reserve currency. As the dollar declines, the yuan rises. China doesn't need to militarily defeat the U.S. China just needs to wait for the dollar to collapse under its own contradictions, accelerated by American financial weaponization. Russia wins strategically. Russia proved you can survive SWIFT cutoff. This demonstration effect is crucial. Every country that feared U.S. financial power now knows there's an alternative. BRICS nations win. Brazil, India, South Africa, and the new members all benefit from a multipolar currency system. They gain leverage. Gold wins. Alternative payment systems win. Who loses? The United States loses hegemony. Not immediately, not catastrophically, but gradually and irreversibly. The dollar's reserve status is the foundation of American power. As dollar dominance fades, all these advantages disappear. The U.S. must balance its budget. The U.S. military becomes unaffordable. This doesn't mean America becomes poor. It means America becomes normal, a large, rich country, but not the hyperpower. Europe loses along with the U.S. European countries tied themselves to the U.S. dollar system. As the dollar declines, the euro doesn't automatically rise. The yuan does. SWIFT itself loses relevance. Dollar holders lose wealth. American consumers lose purchasing power. Let me end with this. The SWIFT weapon looked powerful. In February 2022, Russia cut off, reserves frozen, maximum pressure. But financial weapons are like nuclear weapons. You can only use them once. After you use them, everyone builds defenses. Russia built alternatives. China accelerated CIPS. BRICS expanded. The petrodollar broke. And now the SWIFT weapon is useless because anyone the U.S. might target has already built alternatives or is building them now. The U.S. could have maintained dollar dominance through economic strength, free trade, and rule-based systems. Instead, the U.S. chose financial weaponization. This worked tactically against small countries like Iran, but against Russia, it backfired. And the backfire is systemic. Britain weaponized finance in 1914, lost reserve currency by 1944. The U.S. weaponized SWIFT in 2022. The pattern says the U.S. loses dollar dominance by 2042. Maybe sooner, because technology accelerates everything. This isn't prediction. This is pattern recognition. Financial weapons always backfire. The dominant power thinks it's exercising ultimate leverage, but it's actually teaching the world to build alternatives. And once the alternatives exist, the original system loses power. The SWIFT weapon destroyed SWIFT's monopoly. The dollar weapon destroyed dollar hegemony. And the country that benefits most is China, the patient rival that watched America destroy its own advantages. China didn't defeat the U.S. militarily. China didn't need to. America defeated itself by weaponizing the tools of its own dominance. This is the end of dollar hegemony, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Not through military defeat, but through financial suicide. The SWIFT weapon worked once. It will never work again, because the world learned the lesson. Build alternatives, diversify away from dollars, never be vulnerable to U.S. financial power again. If this documentary showed you a pattern you didn't see before, if you understand that financial weapons backfire, then you understand the next 20 years of geopolitics. The dollar will decline, the yuan will rise, the world will be multipolar, and the U.S. will be weaker. Not because of Chinese aggression, because of American policy. The U.S. had the golden goose, and it strangled it with sanctions. Welcome to the post-dollar world. It's not here yet, but it's coming. The timeline is set. The pattern is clear. The SWIFT weapon was the trigger. And 20 years from now, historians will look back at February 2022 and say, well, that's when American financial dominance ended. They just didn't know it yet. Subscribe to the channel if you want to understand how money and power really work. Because the next 20 years will rewrite the global order, and most people won't see it coming.